I know we had a short lunch and there's a lot of things happening. So the right people are in the room right now. Thank you for being here. I want to quickly do something that I intended to do last night, but I didn't, so I'm doing it now. There is a woman named Shonda Chapman. Who knows Shonda Chapman? People know Shonda Chapman? Great. Well, the rest of you are about to get to know her. So there's something called the Beyond the Bars Fellowship, which helps to organize this conference. And the fellowship is now 6 years old. The second year of the fellowship, Shonda was a fellow. What's the year you always rep your set? 2015, 2016, okay. The best year. So Shonda was a fellow, and she is now the program director of the fellowship, in addition to her work at the Ms. Foundation, running a fund for girls. She's also the mother of Jabari in Jamaica. She's a wonderful human being, and we just want to celebrate her for a moment, so we just give her a little bit of love. She's going to come share a tiny bit about the fellowship, and then we're going to get our show moving.
Thanks, Kim, putting me on the spot. Appreciate you. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I won't take up too much of your time, but I do want to make sure I take a moment to really shout out the Beyond the Bars Fellows. They are really the machinery behind everything that you see happening here. I would say the vision you see is executed by the Beyond the Bars Fellows here, and they have taken a lot of time over the weeks that we've spent together. The Beyond the Bars Fellowship is a really intentional learning community of people from a really diverse set of backgrounds. We have people who have spent many years in prison, to students here, to people who are practitioners, to people who are academics, and we all get together every week in the interest of learning about our system of criminalization and incarceration with a goal to ending it. And we do that together in close proximity to each other. And then with the rest of our time, we work on planning this conference that you're here attending. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here and for bringing all of the good energy and the good vibes into this space. I always say that the Beyond the Bars conference is more like a conference/family reunion. I'm always lifted up when I leave here, and I've gotten more hugs, I think, than I have in probably the whole year, right? So thanks for being here. If you see someone with a hoodie on, chances are they are a Beyond the Bars fellow. So shout them out and thank them for their work. Thank you. And without further ado.
Welcome home. How was lunch? Really fast. We have our third plenary, and then after this session, we're breaking into smaller workshops. You should check your pamphlet to see what our delicious choices are. Is that all right? So this third plenary is called Bridging Movements for Justice. And I want to say one of the things that I love about this conference is that we're all in this room, and so we can check each other's histories, right? So at the last session, Andrea explained the origins of the struggle for alternatives to detention for parenting and custodial caretakers, right? Those corrections are part of building solidarities. And I wanted to appreciate that happened, but I think many of us can do it to each other. I was talking to Dara, and I was saying, I shouted you out about no researcher on us without us. And she said, everybody thinks that's the disability rights movement, but it's really South Africa. So remembering the erased roots of lots of the civil rights and human rights and social justice struggles that we celebrate feels really crucial. And so those aren't corrections in this room. Those are friendly amendments in the building of solidarities. Let me also say that our session is called Bridging Movements for Justice, Lessons, Solidarities, and the Road Ahead. And sometimes I think when we talk about solidarities, we could also talk about fragilarities, because some of them are solid and some of them are a little fragile. And I know that we're going to get into that, and I hope we do. And our moderator today is Breon Bain. Who here knows Breon Bain?
Hey, we know Breon.
Who here loves Breon Bain?
That's my professor.
Oh, well, you gotta say that. Did he say you gotta say that? Breon Bain, UCLA Prison Education Program, Associate Professor, his professor, Department of African American Studies, Department of World Arts and Cultures, Dance, UCLA. If anybody should moderate a panel on movements, there's this man who takes it seriously, political movements and physical movements, spoken word and ethical practice with people. So Breon, you're on.
Peace, family. How y'all doing? You making it through, enjoying Beyond the Bars? Give it up for all the organizers who put this together, first and foremost. All the hard work, countless emails, stapling documents. Yes, a lot of work goes into it. We stand on native indigenous land. I want to recognize that first and foremost and recognize the solidarity that we have with our brothers and sisters in indigenous communities as we struggle against capitalism, as we struggle against slavery, as we struggle against genocide and colonization. I want to recognize that solidarity first and foremost. It is my honor to be here and to moderate this panel, which basically for me means to get out of the way and let these brilliant folks shine and talk about the wonderful work they do and to explore this idea of solidarity and what it means. About 6 years ago, I had the distinct opportunity to moderate a panel with two elders on this very topic. And I sat between Dolores Huerta and Harry Belafonte. I did not say much, but it was a powerful conversation, and so I want to share with you just briefly some of what came out of that conversation. We began with the words of Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti, who says that to be radical means to go to the root. To be radical means to go to the root. So if we want to talk about cutting down the leaves and the branches, that's going to do something, but it's not going to do everything we need done. We need to go to the root and find out where these roots intersect and where the original internet of trees' roots speaking to each other is a metaphor for how we should be in community and in solidarity with each other. That's first. Secondly, Brother Harry and Sister Dolores were very clear. They said we have a choice in that conversation. We have a choice of thinking about our solidarity, thinking about our movement work as being in working towards fixing broken systems, fixing systems that have been broken, or to think about our work as being about actually addressing systems that are functioning just as they were designed to function in the first place. And if we have that orientation, we will approach the work in a radically different way, because we know that there actually may be some breaking that needs to happen in order for us to actually get things to where they need to go, all right? So the broken systems theory, it was another important insight that came out of this. Last but not least, before I introduce our panelists and have them begin talking about themselves and their work, I want to bring to your attention something else that came out of it. They talked a lot about specifically black and brown solidarity and some of the challenges, which we'll talk about today, other forms of solidarity that we need to address as well. But I want to take a moment and just figure out who is in the room. How many folks identify themselves as working in a space of pushing for indigenous justice, indigenous rights, with movements that are about indigenous peoples, native peoples? Raise your hand by show of hands, okay. How many folks see themselves as working on issues of policing, anti-policing, police out of our communities, okay, no more occupation by police, okay. How many folks see themselves as working in policing specifically with a gender LGBTQ lens? How many folks are in that identified with that movement, okay? All right, how many folks identify themselves as working on crimmigration issues, right? The link between incarceration and immigration and how the criminalization of immigration, how those are related. Show of hands, keep your hands up. Okay. How many folks see themselves as working in movements around environmental justice, climate justice? Show of hands. Okay. Okay. How many folks identify themselves as abolitionists? That's just about everybody. Okay. All right, so we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. And before I introduce our very first panelist, a brief word from that I have to share from the piece that came out of the Dolores and Harry conversation. This is from scholar Gay Teresa Johnson, who says, "A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has even put on its shoes. Contemporary conservative news sources have been a relentless source of characterizations that depict the relationship between black and brown communities as little more than eternally tense, inherently competitive, and sometimes mutually violent. At times, this has been the only audible discourse in discussions about the futures of these communities. And it has been more lie than truth, while in the record of black-brown interactions, there have been devastating examples of intergroup tension. There are far more examples of mutually meaningful black-brown anti-racism struggles and radical creative affiliations." With that, I want to turn to our panelists. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of them and then have them say a little bit more. And then we will go into some questions, some answers, and then we'll open it up to everyone here. So if you have questions that bubble up, write them down so we can make sure we get your voice in the conversation. Tia Oros Peters is an indigenous Zuni woman. She serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, an identity-based Native philanthropic advocacy and leadership development organization founded in 1977. She is also co-founder and convener of the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus and of Indigenous Women Worldwide. Please give it up for Tia, who is with us here today. Andrea Ritchie is a black lesbian immigrant whose writing, litigation, and advocacy is focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBT people of color for the past 2 decades. She is currently researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization at the Barnard Center for Research on Women and the co-author of Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, among other works. Please put your hands together for Andrea, who's here with us today. Peggy Shepard is co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice and has a long history of organizing and engaging Northern Manhattan residents in community-based planning and campaigns to address environmental protection and environmental health policy locally and nationally. Please put your hands together for Peggy Shepard. Also, straight off the red eye here, we Paul Sock came to the States. You can give it up for him. Go ahead, you know. Came to the States as an infant child of Cambodian refugees. Then at 16, his single-parent father passed away and he became parentless. The school system soon pushed him out and left him without resources, and he ended up in the streets, taken into the juvenile justice system, and tried as an adult. After 16 years inside, he became one of the first and few to benefit from legislative changes and won early release. He's been forced to navigate the crimmigration system without an attorney, and he continues to work to organize in Los Angeles with the Youth Justice Coalition. Please put your hands together for Paul. Timmy Rose is an organizer with the Centers who works specifically around issues against the police, against prisons. His work is committed to the spirit and practice of abolition. He sees the work of anti-police and anti-criminalization as inextricably connected to the work of anti-militarization. The military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex are inextricably connected in his work. Please put your hands together and welcome Timmy Rose. And I want to start off by having each of them say a bit more about themselves and their work, and we will start off with Sister Tia.
Matches my outfit better anyway. Keshi, gonna don napkya. I really appreciate the words and the opportunity. I prepared some comments. So I'm going to start off like that to get this conversation rolling on my part. I want to thank the indigenous peoples on whose territory we are, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Karnasi, the Shinnecock, and neighboring nations of this region on whose homelands we are meeting. And their energy, their ancestors are informing all of our conversations today. I recognize the spirits that are here, ancient and everlasting, acknowledging them for their presence, informing us, and guiding us, our thinking, our doing, our dreaming, and our ways of being. This is especially important and apparent when we come together like this to talk about these issues, critical issues like the targeting and the devouring of our peoples, our communities, and our homelands, through the unrelenting pursuit, the unrelenting violence of this carceral society, and of the colonialism, the Christianization of our peoples, and its many forms and manifestations. This is what I'm here to share with you today, about issues and realities that span far beyond the immediacy of our own lives and what we want today. Even for those of us where such issues have struck us personally, this issue is not new for indigenous peoples. We understand how our peoples are being held prisoners now as a form of ongoing colonization and oppression, something that stems from evil that was planted here a long, long time ago, years ago, and it continues to ripple and accelerate in brutality, in horror, and in its devastation. So my name is Tia Oris Peters, and I'm Zuni. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm an auntie, I'm a sister, I'm a wife, I'm a land defender, and I'm a water protector. With my husband's people, the Pulikla, I'm a woman of world renewal ceremony. I serve the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which is part of the Indigenous Peoples Movement. We're a transnational organization. Our vision and our work, it's not confined to colonial borders or the bars of colonial thinking. Core to what we do, and we do it throughout the Indigenous world, is the belief in the inherent strength of our peoples and our capacity. Our purpose is re-indigenization. Re-indigenization, which is the active and dynamic process of recovering traditional relationships to land, community, and culture, and in spirit for self-determination, for our collective liberation, and to restore balance. Fundamental to this is the rejection of white supremacist Christian colonial patriarchy, because we know this is assumed framework for mainstream society. This is not our thinking, our way of being, or of our action. We know that this holds nothing for our liberation or for our futurity. Those are all the comments I have for now.
Thank you. Thank you. That was the right way to start, wasn't it? Yeah. Absolutely. All right. We are going to next ask for Sister Peggy Shepard to offer some more introductory remarks about herself and her work.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see this room because I am not used to being in such diverse convenings, unless I'm with, folks in my movement. But my everyday work does not look like rooms like this. So this is wonderful. I'm so glad you're all here and that we've got this great panel to be able to talk a little today about how we could work together rather than in our silos. So I got started 31 years ago, just up the street, holding up traffic on Martin Luther King Day in 1988 to protest the emissions from a sewage treatment plant that was making everyone in West Harlem sick. And we have evolved over those years to be an organization that's membership-based, that takes movement building and community organizing as critical, and that works to develop policies that protect our communities from the disproportionate impact from pollution and racism here in this city and in this country. So I really got started understanding that I was not in a silo when we had the 1991 first Environmental Justice Leadership Summit, where we developed 17 principles of environmental justice. And you can Google those, and you will find that even today, they are so current. We also, about 10 years ago, convened a national coalition of environmental justice groups around climate change because we understood the impact that climate change will have comprehensively on our lives and our economy, and we understood that people of color and low income were being left out of that debate. So we organized 44 organizations across 20 states to ensure that our voices in our communities were being heard on these issues that affect all of us, whether it's our health, whether it's our property, whether it's our economy and our energy. So we understand that environmental justice is a civil rights analysis of environmental decision making, that our communities are left out of the debate and the policies that impact all of us, that we're not in the major green groups, we're not on their staff or boards, we're not on the major advisory committees and commissions that really impact policy. And so we have worked to organize community residents. 20% of our 800 members here in Harlem and Northern Manhattan are in public housing. And we understand that low-income folks do understand these issues and think they are a priority because they are affecting them, in fact, in more ways than we all understand. And when they get a little support, they are willing to be the leadership and take ownership of some of these issues in their communities. So if solidarity were a food, what would I choose? Well, I would choose water, because not only is it refreshing and restorative, but is actually essential to our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. By way of context, in our preparation for today, I did ask each of the panelists to think about, if solidarity were a food, what would it be and why, right? What would solidarity taste like, right? What would it smell like? What would it feel like? What would it sound like, right? So we will hopefully get a little bit of that from each of them before we're done today. Next, I want to ask Timmy Rose to offer some introductory remarks.
What's up? Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the organizers of Beyond the Bars for having me. And also for my co-panelists, it's really an honor. I hope we have more time to connect off the panel because I know how these things can feel rushed with time. But a little bit more about who I am. I started doing political work with an organization called We Charge Genocide, which was out of Chicago. And I think it's important to usually, I make a point of naming that because that was an international fight to shine a light on the international stage on the violent torture tactics of the Chicago Police Department, all the way to that culminated to sending a group of Black and brown Chicago youth to the United Nations. I moved on to working with a collective called the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which was a collective of artists, activists, lawyers that got together and ultimately fought for the reparations for Burge torture survivors, for folks who were systematically tortured and abused by Chicago Police Department. Currently, I organize with a formation called the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, and that is a arts and education program an organizing program, although we can't say that, operating within the Stateville Maximum Security Prison, which is about an hour outside of the city of Chicago. There we do arts and education programming, but I also co-facilitate with one of my close collaborators, Alice Kim, who's also in Chicago, where we facilitate the PNAP think tank, which there we have a lot of advocacy conversations about how challenging issues impacting folks, mostly around long-term sentencing. So we're doing work around clemency and also abolishing life without parole. So I'm sure there's going to be more space to talk about that. And so currently I work with PNAP, and then also I co-founded and now an organizer with a new formation called Dissenters, which is a youth-based organization that wants to ultimately challenge systems of war and militarism, right? Are there any dissenters in the room right here? Columbia actually has a chapter. So at base, I'm an anti-war organizer, and I think that even the work that I do with inside Stateville and the work that I did challenging policing in Chicago is anti-war work. It's anti-militarist work. One thing that kind of, I think, illuminates how I came to be now, I'm the son of a Vietnamese immigrant that moved away from the country, who experienced war and violence, and moved to this country. And you know, as I was doing work with the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials and the fight for reparations, I learned deeply about the torture tactics of the Chicago Police Department, including electric shock, black boxes, just beating, and something that I learned that was that many of those torture tactics used by the Chicago Police Department, first of all, most of those police officers were veterans of the Vietnam War. And in fact, many of those torture tactics they used and perfected in Vietnam. And so I think a lot of where I'm at right now is connects a lot of these overlapping intersectional struggles and also intersectional violences, right? And yeah, I'll cover it off there.
Thank you. Give it up. Give it up. So for our next speaker, first I have to say big up all the Caribbean Massive. Any Caribbean folks here, West Indian people in the room, make some noise, make some noise. Anybody, a couple? We usually a little more rowdy than that, you know. All right, so giving it up for one of your own, straight from Jamaica. Please give it up for Andrea Ritchie, y'all.
Thank you. My answer to what solidarity would look like as a food is ital stew, which, have you had it? Have you know what I'm talking about, right? It blends individual flavors and textures into a whole and then adds a little spice. And it's healthy, nourishing, sustaining, and has a dash of spirituality. So to answer that question first. So if you're visiting New York and you haven't had some ital stew, come find us in Brooklyn. We'll feed you some. Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to be on this panel. As Breon said, I'm a Black lesbian immigrant. I'm also a survivor of state and interpersonal violence. And I name all of those things because they're not immediately apparent from looking at me, depending on whether I've just been to Jamaica or not. But also because all of these identities inform how I do the work that I do. And so I've actually had the privilege and honor of being part of a lot of the movements that we are talking about and have talked about. I've been part of movements for Black liberation for as long as I can remember, and now have the honor and privilege of sitting on the Movement for Black Lives policy table. My first kind of turn up intensely movement was the anti-apartheid movement and the movement for divestment at universities and colleges. And I know that Columbia was successful where we failed at Cornell, and that it has been successful in divesting from the prison industrial complex in other ways too. I also came up through the gender and reproductive justice movement and had the privilege of serving on the national collective of Insight, Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence, that Dr. Davis mentioned last night. That's an actual organization. She wasn't just talking about insights of women of color and trans people against state violence. She was talking about an organization that is celebrating its 20th year this year, and we invite you to come over to across the street to Barnard on April 30th. We'll be talking about how Insight and Dr. Davis brought us the concept of abolition feminism, understanding the gendered nature of the violence of the prison industrial complex, and also how we need to dream new responses to gender violence that will actually keep us safe. I've had the privilege of being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, beginning from a pretty young age when colonialism came to my backyard, literally, where the Canadian Army enforced an occupation of land close to where I grew up on in Oka, the land of Ganasatake and the Indigenous people of that land. And for those of you who are not following what's happening in Canada now, the Army is again enforcing colonialism on unceded territory in British Columbia, and Canada has been shut down for the last 3 weeks, by folks in solidarity with that nation and those communities, and I encourage you to check it out and support them online. I also had the privilege of being part of the environmental justice movement, and it's such an honor to be on this panel because I was learning about and writing about We Act's work in 1990 in Toronto. And I was like, is Black folks in the Bronx talking about this waste disposal? I didn't know where the Bronx was. I was living, I've never been to New York. I didn't know what I was talking about. But I was like, and just like that, this waste treatment plant that's in the Don Valley community, that's a community of color, is having similar impacts on our community. So you were inspiring work that I was engaged in at that time. And I think that the last thing I'll say is, Maya was telling me this as we were preparing. My first arrest and school suspension was an anti-war demo, so I've just made these rounds, I think, and also been involved in movements for immigrant justice. Now I get the privilege of working with Mariam Kaba and Woods Irvin, who you heard from last night at the Interrupting Criminalization Initiative at Barnard, where we're working to interrupt criminalization. I'll tell you more about that. To serve on the Movement for Black Lives Policy table and to be a founding member of Communities United for Police Reform, the multi-hundred organization campaign and movement that that took on and challenged stop and frisk here in New York City and is working to end broken windows policing and policing in New York City as it is right now. So yeah, and ITAL Stu, have some.
Thank you very much. Give it up one more time. Our last panelist has life experience that is as influential, as important as his work on the ground on a daily basis. I have to say that I had the first opportunity to work with him back in 2017 when starting this prison education program at UCLA, along with folks like Rosie Rios, who's here somewhere, and Brisa Smith-Flores, who's here as well. We were going into the juvenile hall in Sylmar, outside of Los Angeles, and working with this brother, we actually were able to put together a 6-week curriculum that was based on human rights, restorative justice, and transformative justice for incarcerated youth from Los Angeles, primarily Black and brown youth, working in poor youth. And so I've seen his work in action and seen how committed he is. So I want to give him an opportunity to talk a little bit about his work himself. Please give it up for Paul Sock.
When survivors speak, systems fall. I think we got to really talk about that, right? But I want to highlight that because we're all survivors of some form or system. I really want to just kind of think along those lines, right? Like slavery was abolished because Black folks and slaves, people that were called slaves, labeled slaves, put themselves on the line. And that's how it was broken down. If it was left to the white man, we'd still be in cages today. We'd still be indentured servants to a country that called itself America, which is only named America because it was put on a map by 2 German map makers in honor of a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. How is that even America? Why do we have the term Native Americans when that land was already here for the indigenous folks? They ain't Americans. They're natives to this land, but they're not Native Americans, right? That's something we really got to think about. But so for me, I'm Paul Soak. I'm with the Youth Justice Coalition. Follow us on @YouthJusticeLA if y'all want to see it. But as Breon was saying, I was a young person, got tried as an adult, went into the system, basically because there was no resources in our communities, right, except for men with badges and firearms. If that's all you got, then what do you got? You're going to get a carceral system. The streets are just a precursor. The streets are just a precursor for Black and brown young people. People of color. I'm not exactly Black or brown, I'm high yellow, if you want to look at it like that. But in any case, right, that's just real talk. But in any case, I went into the system. I'm a self-taught jailhouse lawyer, if you want to call it that. I don't need no law degree to go tell you I sued the U.S. government for my own liberation. I hit them with equitable estoppel and all kinds of crazy stuff. People are like, what did you do? People with law degrees didn't even understand how I did it. I said, hey, would you like to see my 20-page memo? It's on paper, so you can look it up. Here's my case number. But in any case, like we have the ability and the power as a community to do things, right? And the only reason I'm at this table is because community brought me here. I didn't have a single penny when I came out the system. But when folks started resourcing me, guess where I'm at today, right? And so that's why I continue to do my work with the Youth Justice Coalition, work with young people, building alternatives to 911 up in the hood, right? That's real talk. Like, how do we have transformative justice in our cities, in our streets? on our corners so folks don't have to call 911. So folks don't have to rely on a system that says, hey, this person is hurting my loved one, but how do I deal with that? Because punishment is not accountability. Right? And accountability has to come from ourselves, and we have to teach each other and learn that amongst ourselves. That's the only way we're going to get to a real abolition state. But we'll definitely talk more, for sure. But one thing Brion didn't mention, another reason why I'm still at this table is because I broke the record in California and got the pardon in the quickest amount of time known in that time. But that's because of work of folks like you. And I appreciate seeing all the young people here. I work with young people on a daily. I just want to encourage all the young people in this room to take what you learned today, because 10 years from now, y'all are going to be able to put this slate as policy, because we're not in those spaces, but you will be. Because the guard that's now, they're going to fade, and y'all are here to take them over, and y'all are going to fill those places. And that's when we're going to see abolition become a real reality.
Thank you, and all remarkably on point and on time. I love it. I love it. This is 21st century CPT, y'all. Don't get it twisted. That's how we're rolling into 2020, all right? All right? That's how it's going to happen. So in the backdrop of these conversations, we move into a couple of questions. The fundamental underlying questions are, how do we learn about and build solidarity, right? What is solidarity? How do we learn about it? How do we build it? How can we learn from each other? How to build on past and present movement strategies, right? We know we can't do this work alone. We know if we've ever needed solidarity, we need it now as much as ever to face the challenges that we have before us. I can't imagine a more different group of folks from such different perspectives bringing so much insight to this conversation. So I want to start off with kind of combining two questions I was initially going to ask and change them a little bit based on what I've heard. So yesterday at Barry J. Nightoff Juvenile Hall, I teach a class on the revolutionary politics and poetry of Malcolm X at the Juvenile Hall. And we have community contracts, like community guidelines. One of the community guidelines that the young brothers came up with is you should call people in and not call them out. That's one of their community guidelines. So there is this tendency in progressive movements and radical movements oftentimes for us to be the first to circle the wagons and shoot each other, right? That is a tendency in certain spaces. What I really want to focus on in this question is when you've been effective, when your movement strategies have been effective and been effective in a way that calls people in, been effective in a way that actually builds solidarity. What is an example of a win or a success, a victory that you have had in your work, right? And what were the challenges you faced in getting to that victory, getting to that win, in being effective, and how did you overcome those challenges? It's two questions, really, that I'm combining into one, and we'll go with whoever wants to start us off. Tia, you want to start us off, please?
I'm going to talk from thinking about and imagining a solidarity, and I'm going to gently challenge you. Okay, so for to understand Indigenous peoples, we're we're the ones you just circled the wagons for, right? So you said circle the wagons and everyone's shooting at you? Like, we're the ones who are doing that. We're the ones who burned down the fort. We need to understand the carceral society as that which stems from colonization. We can't throw around the term decolonization like a hipster headdress. We need to think about it in terms of those first bloody footprints and how it continues today, including sometimes in our casual references. That's why I had to call you on that, dear brother, because I can't let that go. Because I'm off the reservation right now, right?
Thank you.
So, and if I was, then I'd have to wear a tag to get off the reservation. So I want to challenge what is happening in the carceral system and our thinking about de-incarcerating, decriminalization. And to have solidarity with Indigenous peoples, it has to start at decolonization. Have to recognize that the land that we're on is stolen and occupied now. And that if we don't start at that root and try to build some kind of solidarity around that root and take accountability in all of our different ways, 1,000 different ways, each of us and collectively. And then we will not be able to move anything forward. We'll be able to see each other. We'll only look at each other as being in each other's way. I really want to bring that. That was really the purpose of even my kind of prepared statement. We had more to say, but wanting to make sure that it's about decolonization and not in terms of a metaphor, because it is not a metaphor. Decolonization is land back. Decolonization is, this is indigenous land. I don't care what it says on your deed or what your address is. It all is. And we really need to start there. For indigenous peoples who are part of that movement, the movement to recover our lands, that's where we start. And I really want to bring that so that we understand exactly where indigenous peoples are in order to build actual partnerships and solidarity and move some collaboration forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have to say thank you for the challenge. Language is important. Language is powerful. So whenever we can lovingly bring each other into a space of understanding how our language can be more liberating and less oppressive, we have to do that. So thank you. Someone else want to jump in?
Let's just frame that one. Has anybody ever looked at a picture of the writers of the Declaration of Independence or whatever it is? I know y'all have seen it, right? Do you ever see a single colored person in there? Do you ever see an indigenous person in there? They're not. Those are the people that wrote the founding documents of the so-called United States of America. When they formed the Constitution, it didn't write about slaves, even though slaves existed. Well, but the term slave, right? Like the literal writing of it and saying it, right? And they said all men are created equal, etc. But is that really true? So that's what we're talking about. That's the people that wrote that. That's what you're referring to when you talk about colonization. It's these folks that created something to supplant something that was already there to say that this is now ours. But when they wrote it, the first laws of the U.S. nationality says that only a free white person can be a citizen of the United States of America. That is that colonization that she's talking about. And that's what we have to get to, because all the carceral systems and every other system that's here that oppresses us is a function of that. It's a offshoot of that. It's a progeny of that. So until we get to that core, we're not going to get anywhere. Because all those systems that are put in place unite together. And oftentimes we work in silos, unfortunately. But because we work in silos, how can we get to that core? We're only chipping here and there, right? Nobody's chipping and getting to that bottom root. And that's what we really need to get to. So that's what she's talking about. Those are the things that we really need to address, right? How do we get there? And so that's the conversation that I hope we can all have and walk away by the end of the day.
Thank you, Paul. As we move forward, I definitely want to push us to think about highlighting those examples of successes, of victories, and to talk about how you've been effective and how you overcame the challenges.
So again, working within the national environmental justice movement, it's one of the few that's multi-ethnic and multiracial, that has networks of indigenous folks, Asian Americans, folks from the South, Black folks, Latinos. And originally we had about 12 networks around the country, and that's the way we convened many times a year. And we were very focused at the very beginning on the EPA and changing environmental regulation. And why at the federal level? Because so many of our organizations, especially in the racist South, are so oppressed that there was no way that locally or statewide they could get any redress. And so at the time, we did a lot of focus at the EPA, getting an Office of Environmental Justice, getting a federal advisory committee that was effective in early years, relocating people in Florida away from toxic waste sites, working with communities in New Orleans to ensure that no more permits for oil or chemical refineries were granted. So we've had some very early, some early victories. But the work has been most effective because our mandate from our first summit was to go home and build a grassroots base. There's no work we can do that's going to be effective for our communities without developing that grassroots base. And then because no organization can do this work alone, we have got to work in coalition, and we've got to work to build those networks nationally with organizations doing this kind of work all around the country, because all of our voices and resources are necessary. Certainly the resources are necessary because we are under-resourced. Organizations that are head by women of color, working on issues in communities of color, do not receive much money. In fact, research has showed that we receive 0.5% of all of the environmental funding that goes on in this country. And so we have been able to work by developing that grassroots space, by decentralizing, not having a central voice where the media can go and get one celebrity voice to speak for all of us. Our mantra is we speak for ourselves. And I think the other thing that locally has made We Act successful in many of our campaigns has been that we have developed an evidence base for all of our campaigns. We do community-based participatory research to understand the impacts of policies and toxins on the health outcomes of people in our communities. And we are able to work with a number of scientists who develop that data for us so that we can then translate that data and research into policies. We just got a Child Safe Products Act passed in Albany after 5 years of work that will take some priority chemicals out of children's products. We now have an environmental justice task force at the city level that is just getting started. And we know that all of these things are part and parcel of a system that has been a racist system. But we also know that unless we are at the table and we are raising our voices and perspectives and developing our own community-based plans, that we will not be successful. But in fact, we can be effective when we are doing that work. Everyone is talking about equity now. That's the buzzword of the last few years. So we have had an opportunity to work with mainstream organizations and folks to really begin to talk about what equity looks like in this country and how all of our perspectives need to be heard. But again, without the community organizing, without working between movements, that really cannot happen. I remember in our first years of work here in New York City, we held a meeting, a convening at the state office building a few blocks away, and we tried to reach out to all of the civil rights groups to talk about how we might work together. We weren't successful. I think maybe 4 people attended that meeting. But we certainly have tried over the years working with movements around housing and tenant leadership to ensure that public housing gets the kind of maintenance and investment that it deserves. Those coalitions are broadening here in New York City. Certainly working with public health movements to ensure that environmental health and the perspective of people of color who experience growing health disparities and early mortality and death. We certainly want to ensure that we're working with that kind of platform and that kind of movement as well. And I believe that there are many ways that Black Lives Matter and all of our organizations and movements could be working closer together so that we are sending the same message. Because when you're a person of color, it doesn't matter that I might work primarily on environmental justice and climate justice. I'm going to be asked about Standing Rock. I'm going to be asked about prison reform. You know, we're working with a project around sustainable Rikers right now. And I have people calling me about what they should do about some of the jails that are going to be developed throughout our communities, and how they need to organize and how they need to work to ensure that those facilities are the ones that will fit well with that community, and the community will be engaged with those facilities. So again, I think there are many, many ways we can work together in coalition, and we need to, because we know that also climate change is going to create climate refugees. We've already had our Caribbean brothers and sisters turned away at the Florida border. We know that there's climate gentrification because the minute some houses or homes are wiped out, we know that more affluent people are buying those properties the way they are in Puerto Rico right now. As people have left and evacuated Puerto Rico, more affluent people are moving in, and the culture will change, just as the way it has been changed in New Orleans, which has total social disruption just because of one hurricane. And so these are all issues that we need to work on together and have our messages so that we can support each other.
Thank you so much. I want to ask Andrea and Timmy, because you both work on policing in different ways, a little more specifically, to talk a little bit about a victory, a success when you've seen your movements be effective, particularly in Andrea's case, because you're working around you're working in this space where policing and police violence and brutality has been gendered in the way that lynching was gendered, as if Black women were not lynched, right? And you're at the same time trying to build solidarity and also getting folks that you perceive potentially within your own movement as pushing against you. And then, for Timmy, similarly, working to challenge the police in our communities can get a lot of pushback from folks in those very communities, right? Often because of class, because of other issues, who see the police not as an occupying force, but as, tied into this myth of them being there to actually bring us safety and security. So how have you seen success given those fissures, those silos, and the need to call people together into your movements?
I think that we're most effective when we're working at the intersections, and that's where we're going to not leave anyone behind. And one of the most effective places I've found to work at the intersections is through criminalization, because the other side is mad intersectional in terms of how they criminalize us, and we're not very intersectional in our resistance, right? We left the folks who were trying to decarcerate folks left you at the gate and let you be taken into detention, deportation, because we were siloed, right? Or we might focus on stop and frisk, but not talk about the ways in which that might impact women, queer and trans people in ways that might produce, for instance, sexual violence in the context of a stop, or lead to a different kind of charge like loitering for the purposes of prostitution, that now you're out of your public housing, you're in a family court proceeding, and if you're a migrant, you're being deported, right? That's a different consequence of stop and frisk for Black women, girls, trans and gender nonconforming people than we were talking about in the context of the stop and frisk movement that we were part of and pushing, but what the larger kind of media was hearing and saying was different, right? I feel like, but criminalization also is really, it's the crux of it. It's where we decide not just what acts are going to be punished by who, when, and how, because, even murder isn't punished all the time, right? Like, you go drop a drone on someone, that's a national security act, that's not murder, right? They murdered someone the other night, right? And so it's not actually about acts, it's about people. It's about groups of people, and it's about who we decide deserves criminalization. And then we'll use any law and come at them, and it doesn't matter, right? And we have to figure out how to unseat that and unseat our understanding of criminalization as the appropriate response to some things. We might disagree about what things, but we have to actually question whether it's an appropriate response to anything in terms of producing safety, security, thriving in our communities. So, to give an example of when I've felt successful, there's definitely these moments, there's a lot coming at us, right? I definitely wake up some mornings being like, hearing future generations calling at me, being like, what are you doing? What have you done? Like, why are you not stopping X, Y, or Z? And I have to remind myself that we have had concrete impact. So one thing I did once was helped get 800 people off a sex offender registry. So sometimes I wake up and I'm like, oh yeah, you did that. Did it under the leadership of Women with a Vision in New Orleans, and did it understanding that criminalization was happening in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, that as a part of this tool of gentrification and basically genocide and ethnic cleansing, they were using this 200-year-old law that criminalized offering oral or anal sex for money. So all you had to say was, I'll give you a blowjob for $50, and you could get charged with crime against nature by solicitation. And we started working with law students. They were like, oh, we're on a crime against nature case. Is that the Horizon oil spill? I was like, no. It's about this charge. And this charge was a felony. And this charge carried a mandatory sex offender registration requirement for 15 years to life. And so people were getting hit with this charge. Guess who was getting hit with the charge? Black women, right? Black trans women, black cis women, black women with disabilities, black gay men, and indigenous people who were, quote unquote, off the reservation. One of our main clients was a Two-Spirit indigenous woman who was tagged by an officer. Her presence was a crime against colonization, or a crime against, she's not supposed to be there, right? She's supposed to have disappeared. And so her presence is then inherently sexualized through colonial narratives and inherently punished. So she gets tagged with this charge. And people who are using, who are dependent on substances and so on, people with disabilities. And so we used multiple strategies. We didn't just pick one. We were like, we're gonna sue you, we're gonna bring lawsuits, we're gonna do policy advocacy, and we're gonna organize, and we're not just gonna do it locally, we're gonna mobilize movements across the country. And if we had come up to people and said, hey, you wanna help get 800 people off a sex offender registry, I bet even a lot of people in this room might be like, well, maybe that's not our #1 priority right now. But we came with this experience of this is what criminalization at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, colonialism, slavery, poverty, disability, ableism, and migration looks like. These are not different stories, they're the same stories. And they're affecting the same people who are being deemed as criminalized. And so by the end, we had multiple movements. We had the civil rights movement, we had racial justice movements, we had reproductive rights movements, we had LGBT movements, we had HIV movements, we had migrant justice movements, we had economic justice movements, and we won. And when we first brought this case, people were like, you'll never win that case. And we were like, well, we have to try. And we won, and we got people off, and we used a version of this 6D strategy that you've been hearing about, which came from the work of incarcerated women. I just want to name that, right? It didn't come from across the street at Barnard. It came from the National Council of Incarcerated Women. It came from the Center for Young Women's Freedom. It came from Women on the Rise. It came from Solution Not Punishment Coalition. It came from all the groups who have been grinding on these kinds of fights, like Women with a Vision on the Ground, for a long time. So they documented the problem. They documented what was happening to people who had sex offender on their driver's license in bright orange letters. Think of all the places you show your driver's license. You have to show something that says sex offender, you're not getting into no shelter, you can't drop your kid off at childcare, you're not getting any benefits, you can't go anywhere, right? So now it's a housing issue, now it's an economic justice issue, and now you can't get anti-violence services now because you have sex offender on your thing. Well, guess who's experiencing most violence in the community then, because people know that they can do it with impunity. And so we documented that. We argued for decriminalization. We argued that Women with a Vision runs a diversion program now, so that anyone who might be arrested for anything related to prostitution just gets to go to them. And it's a non-coercive one. When you walk in, they just say, what do you need? We'll get it to you. That's it. No one gets reported for not doing anything. No one's mandated to anything. We fought to decarcerate, right? And looking at decarceration broadly in the way that James was teaching us earlier, right? That incarceration happens through surveillance on sex offender registries. And parole and probation officers can just violate you back at the drop of a hat and put you back inside. So decarceration has to mean taking out of sex offender registries too. And divesting from the notion that we're gonna criminalize people who are just trying to survive by incarcerating them and then giving them a marker on their bodies or on their driver's license that is going to drive them further into the conditions that had them trading sex in the first place. And we're going to dream a whole other way of meeting our community's needs. And so that, to me, was working at the intersections using criminalization the way they use criminalization, but in resisting it intersectionally and bringing together movements in a way that had concrete material impacts on people's lives.
Thank you.
It's hard to follow that. Thank you, Andrew.
I think you have
A little struggle in Chicago, yeah. I mean, there's so many things floating around in my head that I want to try to do my best to piece it all together, but I wanted to jump back to the question of solidarity. And what does that actually look like? Because I think we throw that word around a lot, and I'm like, what does that even really mean? Or what are we even referring to? And I think it's particularly important, right? Because implied in a lot of the responses I'm hearing from my co-panelists is it's about building together. It's about identifying the tactics and systems of violence in which we are all connected to and resisting, and using that as a potential way to, as a starting point to actually organize together, identifying that that prisons and carceral society was one part and parcel to the process of settler colonialization, right? And making these connections, right? When I think about solidarity, to throw in another phrase that I often question is intersectionalism, right? And I think solidarity, one way of thinking about it is intersectionalism in practice, and breaking down silos. I think it's taking the understanding that all of our struggles are connected and then organizing ourselves with that understanding. I think for me that means a deep commitment to learning and understanding each other's struggles as a starting place, and then being willing to throw down for each other, whether through actions, sharing our skills and strategies and tactics, and spreading awareness of each other's struggles. I think I had the blessing and opportunity to go to on a delegation to Palestine, where I was able to meet up with a group called Free Palestine. Free Palestine, always Free Palestine. And I had the opportunity to go, yeah. I had the opportunity to build and connect with organizers from a group called Adamir, which is a group that organizes to support political prisoners and challenge human rights abuses at the hands of Israeli forces. And for a bit of context, in Palestine, that 40% of males have been imprisoned by the Israeli state. 70% of Palestinian families have been touched by the Israeli carceral regime, right? So we're talking about a community that has been deeply, deeply impacted by a carceral regime, right? A settler colonial regime. And I got to meet and build with them, and one of the tactics that incarcerated folks use super well there are hunger strikes. And so we got to chop it up about how do y'all pull hunger strikes off literally almost every other week, it seems like. And we got to talk about how that actually requires having deep, deep relationships with community members and family members out the outside that are able to mobilize really quickly when folks decide that they need to mobilize around a particular demand. And I got to bring those conversations back with me to Stateville, where we're constantly strategizing on like different inside-outside tactics on mobilizing and movement building, right? So I think that's one tangible way that solidarity can look like. I also think about, we have 4 dissenters chapters in the city of Chicago, and just yesterday they worked alongside, they took action alongside the Chi Nations Youth Council as a solidarity action with the folks resisting in Wet'suwet'en territory. And so, because for dissenters, we understand that indigenous resistance is a resistance against militarism, and that militarism has historically been a tactic and tool that lays the foundation for settler colonial violence. And so, in many ways, you could call that solidarity, or you could just call it an anti-militarist praxis. I also want to kind of then the question around like successes, right? And I think there's a lot of examples that Andrea shared, so I'm gonna just kind of maybe share some questions that I think as an organizer I try to stay grounded in, and when we're thinking about wins and successes. And I think also in dissenters is how are we, one, changing the material conditions, right? So how are we chipping away at the systems that were the carceral systems, and chipping away at these systems, but and again, as other panelists have said, building up the alternatives, right? Building up life-affirming systems, but then also how are we changing the ideological terrain, right? And I think that's something that prison abolitionists and abolitionists generally have done an incredible job, including Black Lives Matter activists and just generally Black liberationist struggle in this so-called country, have laid the groundwork for what is even politically possible for us on the ground, and setting the ideological terrain for our organizing. Some other questions I think are important to consider, and when we talk about wins, is who did we educate in this process? Who did we educate in our campaigns? What did we learn from this? Did we develop new leaders? Did we bring in more folks? And is our movement as a whole in a better place than it was before? And one win I'll share that I think was really pivotal for my organizing experience last year was at Stateville, we organized the graduation of the first cohort of bachelor's degree folks, men incarcerated at Stateville, that got their first cohort of bachelor's degree students at Stateville in over 2 decades. Yeah. And with that graduation, first of all, shout out Angela. She was our keynote speaker. She came into the prison with us to give our keynote address. We were able to pull in for our musical performance, Chance the Rapper, right? And then for opening remarks, we had the Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, who folks are unfamiliar, she has been leading the charge on trying to bring in the stories of folks most impacted and weaving that as much as possible into the governor's office in Illinois right now. And so I think in many ways the graduation ceremony was one of these moments where one is a celebration of the fact that we have been providing education, right, material access to education and resources and knowledge to folks on the inside for a significant amount of time, but it was also a political moment that really shifted the conversation around who's disposable, right? And who is worthy of celebration, right? And the entire conversation about who deserves access to life and who deserves our love and trust. So I think that was a big win for us, and I think we could go, that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Can y'all hear me through this? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists before we open it up and ask our panelists if they can keep their answers to about a minute or two, then we might have a little more time to open it up to everyone else in the space. And the question I want to ask, we talked about successes, wins, victories. I want to ask about a point of crisis, a moment of crisis that you, in your work and your movements, have experienced, how you work through it. For the communities that I identify with, Black folks, immigrant folks, working folks, right, we feel oftentimes that we're always in a state of crisis, right? We were robbed of our names, right? I don't know, most of the Black folks I know have European names, right? We were robbed of our languages, robbed of our religions, our folkways, our mores, our norms. How do you do that and not feel as though you're in a state of crisis every day of your life, occupied in a foreign land? But I want for this moment to focus on a particular instance of crisis that you identified within your work, within your movement, and how in some way building solidarity was a part of working through that crisis. If we can have folks offer their thoughts on that, we'll then move to opening it up.
Cool. I think for me, in working in the immigration space in particular, oftentimes folks will throw people under the bus. That's just the reality of it. You know, some people even quoted Obama saying, "Families not felons." I was like, well, if you want to call somebody a felon, fine, but they also have a family too, so now what about that? Right? There's like these weird dichotomies and contradictions that people have. And so a lot of times the challenge though is because that folks from immigrants' rights side is working over here and folks from CJ's side are working over here, and all of a sudden some issue pops up and then it becomes a crisis. Like, what do we do about this? Well, ultimately, y'all should have been talking to each other from the beginning. You wouldn't have that crisis. And so that's one issue. But something concrete that I could talk about is we work a lot on all kinds of policies, legislation, et cetera. We worked on school push-out issues. Like, so many young people get pushed out of school. That's the reason why we have a high school at YJC. But in any case, folks were like, well, go give us this. Do we want to go with the bill? We were like, no, man, we're gone. Bye. And then some folks left with us, but then some folks stayed on. And ultimately, what you get is a policy that only protected people from like up to like 6, 7, 8 years old. But like, damn, like people needed something above that, right? But ultimately, it got watered down and it died. It's a longer story behind all that. But those are like the things that happened, right? And that was kind of like a moment of crisis that we saw just in terms of like how our young people were had an opportunity, but then folks were like withdrawing, and then folks didn't want to come along because folks just wanted that little piece of a win. But to take that little piece of wind, you threw away a whole generation of middle school students, a whole generation of high school students, instead of saying, you know what, F that, we'll come back next year. Let's do it again. Right? People gave up on it. And so those are like the things that we have. And so unfortunately, folks, ultimately I think it's also because as folks that's not impacted working in that space. The impacted folks are the ones holding the ground. The people with the law degrees were like, well, no, let's just, right? Because they're structured to thinking what the JD taught them. We're like, we're organizers. We create those laws that you're working with. What are you talking about? All right, let's think outside that box.
I just want to, on the notion of crisis, and I think I wanted to, I think something that stuck out to me at the panel last night was the war on drugs was actually a war on people, was a war on poor people, right? And so for me as an abolitionist and as an internationalist, thinking about the war on terror as a war on poor black and brown people, and terrorists and criminals as the same language of criminalization and militarization, globally, right? And I think for me, crisis, and for us as dissenters, how are we organizing ourselves? A big question is, how are we organizing ourselves in deeper solidarity with our comrades in the so-called global South? What are we doing about the drone bases that are being built in Niger as we speak? The bombs that are being dropped across the Middle East, right? The exportation of this same carceral state that we are organizing against right now. And just so for some context, in 2003, we started the war in Iraq, correct? And in 2004, the prison population in Iraq was 7,000. By 2012, that went from 7,000 to 45,000, right? So we are exporting a carceral regime around the world, right? When we're talking about militarism, right? And I think this issue of crisis is like, when we're talking about anti-war and militarism, there is no crisis if you watch our media or anything like that. We are in a military state where the crisis, they've learned from the Vietnam War, they've learned from past struggles that what they need to do is erase any sense of a crisis, because right now we are in war in so many different, we are actively engaged in warfare in so many different places across the world. So actually a challenge for us as internationalist abolitionists is actually to create the crisis, to educate folks on the crisis. So,
thank you.
Well, I resonate with my brothers here. We are in a current state of ongoing settler colonization. We are not post-colonial. We are in an ongoing situation of violence against indigenous peoples is violence against the earth. Violence against the earth is violence against indigenous peoples. Plain and simple. And there is no crisis. We're in it. We are occupied. I don't think of the dichotomy of like what's been good and what's been bad. It's all been good. I'm not supposed to be sitting here. And some of the other indigenous peoples in this room, we're all supposed to be dead. We're supposed to be annihilated off the face of this planet. Our songs, our ceremonies, our memories, our houses, our ideas, our technologies, we're not supposed to be here. Unless whatever could have been devoured by the colonial state and then regurgitated up as if it was theirs. That's what's supposed to be here. But we're still here. That's a win, okay? But does that mean that we won the fight? We haven't won. We haven't won. Up there in Wet'suwet'en territory and all across north of the Medicine Line, Canada, they're winning. So they're kind of creating that little rumble right up there, but that's been a long time, 528-year war. That's just another icon, cultural icon, action icon on the face, on the landscape of our movement. That's what that is. Is that a win? Is that a crisis? Is that solidarity? It's all of it, it's all of it. I don't think in those dichotomies because we have not yet gotten our land back. People are still trying to shoot us. We got targets on our back simply because we've survived. Indigenous peoples are among the most incarcerated peoples, from boarding schools and mission systems, and the monjerillos, which were the places they put little girl children from the age of 8 in missions, okay? The first missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? To be disappeared. That this is not yet a win. To bring things to the attention, to have this opportunity, which is a responsibility, right? As much as it is an opportunity, maybe a little glimmer. But I gotta go back. We're in an ongoing situation of settler colonialism. That if we participate and engage in it, we are perpetuating a colonial state. That's the fight. And land back. That's the win.
Well, I could certainly talk about a lot of crises that are occurring, issue-oriented every day. But I think the main crisis is that you probably have a stereotype of the person sitting next to you. I think the current crisis is that we need to undo racism. And I know that for many years tore apart the environmental justice movement, where Latinos felt, well, gee, why should you have faith leaders or churches involved? Because our Catholic Church has oppressed us as Latinos. So they couldn't understand that. That created a division. When we went to the conference on racism in Durban, South Africa, and talked about reparations, our brothers and sisters from the Indigenous Environmental Network said, no reparations for Black people until Native Americans get it. And so that divided us for almost 10 years, not speaking to each other. I live up the street in a community that's diverse, but on one side of the avenue is Black folks and the other side is Latino folks, and we almost never get together. And when we've talked about getting together and try to reach out to other Latino organizations, they say, oh, well, it's kind of too controversial to develop a project about, dialogue together. When we think about the upcoming elections in 2021 here in New York City, as well as I'm sure in other cities around the country, are we going to be together in voting for a new mayor and citywide races that will really affect all of us and give us all equity, or will we be torn apart by individual ethnic rivalries? I used to think that undoing racism was just for groups that were primarily white. But I understand that each one of us in our ethnic silos need to have that training, because we do not treat each other in the way that we need to be treated. And that keeps us from truly working together and understanding each other, because actually we don't understand each other. And we don't understand each other's cultures in the way that we need to really fully have solidarity together.
Right. Thank you. So we're going to open it up, and I want to encourage you, implore you to keep your questions brief. But I also want to say that I want to push folks to think about not just questions, but also answers, right? If you can keep them brief. And specifically, the question I have for everyone in the room, including our panelists, but not exclusively our panelists, is, what are specific ways that those of us here can work together to expand solidarity? Like, very specific ways that we can work together. The movement's represented here, movement's not represented here. And I want to encourage you to try to keep it to 1 to 2 minutes. A question for the panelists or a response to that question. I saw 1 and 2 hands, please. Yours.
Thank you. I'm really honored with this panel, and it's to just be in this room. And I've been coming to this conference for years, and I'm really excited to finally be having this kind of a conversation in terms of solidarity and like what that actually means. I came out of the labor movement. I came out of the rank and file. I came out of like one of the hardest shops. I have experienced all different forms of solidarity, but I think especially coming from the labor movement and that history, to be able to call each other sister and brother, and that's what we did. That's how we greeted each other as sister and brother, right? And my old shop like went on strike, you know, and you show up. You really learn like the value of showing up in that moment, right? You like come and you feed people. You make sure like you don't cross that line, right? And so, but you know, we were burnt out. Like we were constantly like operating as so many of our movements do. You're always operating like your back is against the wall and you're fighting your way out of the corner. And I came to restorative justice work because I was just like, this is like the heart of like what we're talking about how do we live in right relationship with each other. Like how do we really come together? Like how do we see each other? And I think that's a lot of like what we're talking about is like how do we actually hear each other's stories. So let me kind of, in terms of like the question that I have for the group, is one of the things that I've been really experimenting with or like looking at as a labor organizer, mediator, circle keeper, is how do we create the spaces where we can bleed red together and heal each other? Because we got 9 months. I'm sorry, but like this is we are like on the verge of a dictatorship. Like we have dark times ahead of us unless we have a fundamental like transformation in how we live in relationship. And that's like block to block. Like, and I just want to tie this in real quick and I'll finish up. But I live in Flatbush, right? And I work outside. Last summer, we had a heat wave, 112. Sunday, the second day of the heat wave, Con Ed shut down the power. So like half of Flatbush, 112 degrees. People's lives are in danger, right? And so in terms of climate justice, like how many RJ folks, the folks that work in the non-industrial profit lands, are gonna open up their doors and go to their neighbors and say like, your power guy, you don't have AC, come stay with me, right? Because to me, like that's actually what it's gonna be looking like, you know, like in terms of how we came together in Sandy, you know, like, and so, and how we didn't come together in Sandy, right? Like how do we start having those spaces and real conversations with each other outside of these conference spaces, where we're actually really kind of talking in conversation in our neighborhoods, in our kitchen tables, et cetera. How do we build that for real?
Thank
So
you.
I put that to you guys as well. Sorry.
Thank you. Can we hear both the first two questions and then have responses? Is that okay? Is that all right? Okay. So the second hand was here, please. All the way from Cape Town.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Zia, and yeah, I work for a nonprofit in Cape Town, South Africa. And so it's been a really eye-opening experience today because we have a lot of different issues. We have a vastly different political context to what's going on here. And I work on prison reformation. We don't have abolition in South Africa yet. It's not a concept that has kind of pervaded society or government or anything like that.
I have to take it back with you.
Yeah, take it back with me. So we work a lot in coalitions together with other organizations. I don't think I've ever been in a room with this many people who are on the same page in terms of incarceration-related issues. It's very small in South Africa, the people who actually care about these kind of issues. But one thing that I wanted to raise in terms of a crisis, the current crisis that we're facing as a movement is gender-based violence. It's bringing the country to its knees right now. And because we have such high rates of gender-based violence and it keeps on going up, you know, we having more punitive policies, more punitive calls by the public. They're calls to, we don't have the death penalty anymore, they're calls to bring it back now. And that is really challenging for us because we've realized that we didn't actually engage with the so-called woman sector who have kind of always been on the opposing team, because they'll be calling for, you know, when someone experiences gender-based violence, it's very publicized, and they will call for life imprisonment, they'll call for very harsh sentences. And so we've always kind of distanced ourselves from them, but now we've realized that that was actually a mistake. And that's a challenge now, and that we need to have solidarity with them in getting on the same page and having the same conversation. And I haven't heard about that in the last kind of 3 days, about what if there's a similar kind of issue here and where there's that tension. I'd just be interested to hear about that.
So responses from the panelists, and I've been given the signal that we're running short on time. So to the extent we can keep it succinct, it would be so much appreciated. Hard to do, but best efforts.
Well, I'll just respond to the woman from Brooklyn. I would say that after Sandy, we did a research project to understand why certain public housing developments had better, outcomes after Sandy, even though they were 2 weeks without electricity, than other developments. And it's about social cohesion. And I would say that we really badly need these conversations being developed in our neighborhoods, in our buildings, in our communities, the kind of conversation we're having right here. So my organization started something called Uptown Chats, and we have these kinds of conversations with a variety of topics in our community, and we try to only get 30 or 40 people so that there could really be a dialogue. So I would just suggest that the way to build that social cohesion, especially in areas of Brooklyn where you might have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different languages being spoken in one building, different cultures who may not even talk to each other, help each other, that will be really important no matter what the emergency is. And before we have an emergency, we need that kind of cohesion.
Can I hitchhike on the way? I think the crisis I was going to talk about was the crisis of imagination that we have, which is that we just keep pushing people kind of from one carceral system to another, right? And so, in terms of the response to how we deal with gender-based violence, Ashley Carter and Ashley Sawyer will be doing a workshop tomorrow on carceral feminism. You can go get schooled there on how we're trying to resist. But Insight, the organization I was talking about earlier, came up as a response to that, to saying, incarceration is gender-based violence. Criminal legal responses to gender-based violence produce gender-based violence. Survived and punished represents people who are survivors of violence who are being incarcerated and criminalized for surviving, many of whom are Indigenous women and Black women and migrant women, right? Because we're not supposed to survive. So, and we're not allowed to defend ourselves because so I think we're trying to figure out the dream part of the 6Ds is about we need to dream the kinds of responses that you're talking about. We need to figure out how keep ourselves safe and take care of each other in our neighborhoods, which requires us to do some deep self-examination about how we participate in and create conditions for gender-based violence or bystand them or let them happen for missing and murdered Indigenous women, Black women, girls, queer and trans women for sure, and to really dream other responses. But I think the piece I just want to push us to do also is to think about, when we're thinking about alternatives to criminalization, one of the things projects we're working on is like, don't say it's a public health issue and push people into the medical system, that if you talk to disabled communities, they're like, hold up, we've been incarcerated in that system for a long time. That's a system of violence. That's not an answer to mandate treatment, right? So real solidarity means we're talking to each other and we're understanding, and we're not just pushing systems or new responses that will criminalize someone else, right? Or leave someone else behind. So just to point people to a lot of materials over there from Interrupting Criminalization that'll help us think those things through. But that's where I would push us to go.
Yeah, so for us at YGC in LA, like we got gentrified out of Inglewood, so folks don't know that story. They brought a train in, so we had to go find another space, and we took over an old courthouse about a year ago. And so we've reclaimed that space. Yeah, Chuco's. But within that space, we have regular meetings every month. A lot of it is based on just really harm and how do we address that harm, right? And so one thing at Chuco's that we do is we use transformative justice, just recognizing that the American idea of restorative justice is oftentimes incorporated to the courts. Other parts of the world don't do that. The true forms of restorative justice is about agency within the communities, within the peoples. And so that's what we've been building through Chuco's. We built the peace treaty right there. There's Black and brown solidarity in the neighborhoods. Our building is safe. We're like a good spot to go to. Y'all can hang out, right? It wasn't like that before, right? Folks were like still having issues, whatever, right? There's things of the system made people divisive and stuff like that. So being able to have those conversations has been how we've really been able to bring that solidarity. But overall, the transformative justice practices, we meet once a month. And then there's a community alternatives to 911, also based on transformative justice, meets also once a month. But what we've been doing is we've been building hubs and putting people out in their communities. They've been putting that to work and been putting it into practices. People have been coming in with like, somebody's from like medical profession, doesn't know anything about criminalization, coming in and say, hey, here's an overdose kit. I'm gonna train you how to use that overdose kit right now. I'm gonna pass them out. So they took it to their neighborhoods. Everybody in those neighborhoods set up the phone. Hey, if we got an overdose, we call this person, you're gonna come with the kit. We're gonna be able to take care of this without having to call 911. Right, without having to rely on the infrastructure that the colonization system put into place. How do we find a way to do that in our own communities amongst ourselves and try to get that autonomy and that agency back? And so that's some of the work that we've been doing to kind of maybe hopefully answer a couple of those questions to kind of bridge that, that gap in the middle.
So, Rosie Rios,
Yes.
please.
All right, can we give them a big round of applause of gratefulness to our panel and our moderator. Fun fact, Breon was my professor in undergrad and really paved the way for me to come here to Columbia, so I'm always super grateful for him. Shout out to committed educators who really take the time to, you know, just cultivate and help their students. So Breon's definitely that. So shout out to you, Breon. Okay, and in the spirit of gratefulness, I also want to acknowledge all of the volunteers that have made the Beyond the Bars conference possible. Yes, so when you see them, please say thank you, be nice, right? And also to our service workers who, you know, sometimes we don't really see, but who put a lot of work into making this space nice and clean for us to use. So yes, let's also acknowledge that as well. Okay, so I want to give you a rundown of what's coming up next for the rest of the day. So we have breakout sessions from 3:30 to 5, and you can find the different breakout sessions on page 6. Starting on page 6 is all of the information, descriptions, and also locations. And so you can, I invite you to please refer to that. And then, so that'll be, again, from 3:30 to 5, and then immediately after at 5:30, we will begin the film screening. So we have 3 film screenings. We Came to Heal, which is a documentary that captures Hala's youth organizing collective. Yes. And then The Underrated, which is a documentary that talks about community resistance in the rural border town of Avianca, Arizona. And then the final screening on clemency. And so all of that information is on page 10. And again, that starts at 5:30. So at this time, this concludes our time here together. And then please make your way to the plenary session, to the breakout groups, and you can find the information in your pamphlet. Thank you.